Thank you very much, Brother Len Jeffries. I really appreciate those remarks. As Brother Len said, we have been, collaborators for a very long time. Not only are we veterans and alumni of ASCAC, but we're also alumni of the First World Alliance in Harlem. And again, he mentioned the Jewish onslaught, and I guess the Jews didn't realize the kind of preparation that we had, and it was so interesting that they should have hit two people who had come through two of the most rigorous schools of, African nationalism. My topic for tonight is the battle for Black history. The battle for Black history. It was our Black shining prince, Malcolm X, who taught us that of all the subjects that we, learned, that history was the one that Malcolm said that's best, formulated to build consciousness, history. Malcolm said that history was the basis of all the other subjects. And of course, Malcolm was right. Malcolm was always right. History is the soul, the very soul of a people's experience. History is more than just the chronicling of events. It's more than just a list of dates and places and times and names. History for a people is the interpretation of a people's reality. History speaks to our strengths, our weaknesses, our trials, our tribulations, our triumphs, our myths, our realities. And the urge to grasp history is one of the strongest urges that human beings have. And you can see it in many ways as you look around you. Look at the interest in genealogy that individuals have, that interest to know at a basic family level, who your own particular grandparents, great-grandparents, and other ancestors were. You see it at a group level in places like West Africa with the griot, people whose specialized function it is to learn the history of their people. We all know the story of Alex Haley and the role that the griot played in reconstructing his personal story. I had a sort of an experience with griots myself in Ghana many years ago in a place called Salt Pond, when I was researching a man called Chief Sam, who led one of the largest Pan-Africanist movements in African America, just a few years before Marcus Garvey, Chief Alfred Sam. And they took me to a place called Salt Pond, where Chief Sam had lived. And the griot there was able to, recite the history, and he was able to give me some information that I had not obtained in the history books. Interestingly enough, when I was in Ghana on that trip, this was 1990, I was also researching the story of Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey. And Brother Len mentioned her as being at the Pan-African Conference in Manchester in 1945. And in the mid-40s, Amy Ashwood Garvey had gone back to Ashanti in Ghana, and she also had an experience very similar to the experience of Alex Haley, where she was able to meet griots and they were able to recite the history of her family. Because as a child in Jamaica, she had heard from her great-grandmother that her roots were in Ashanti, and the great-grandmother had given her little smatterings of information. She had given her name, for example, Ya Asantewa. And Mrs. Garvey was able to go back and was able to speak to griots, and she was able to reconstruct the history. In fact, very similar to Alex Haley. In fact, her story is so similar to Alex Haley's that I would have said she had plagiarized Alex Haley, had it not been for the fact that she did this about 20 years before Alex Haley. So there was no possibility of her plagiarizing Alex Haley, but her story was almost identical in many ways. So history then is something that we have a great yearning for, and our people have always had this great yearning for our history. If you go back to Herodotus, the man that the Greeks and the Europeans called the father of history, meaning the father of their history, Herodotus in the 5th century BC went to Kemet. And Herodotus tells us that when he was in Kemet, Egypt, that he spoke to historians. And this is amazing. Here's a man who the Europeans say is the father of history, and he himself tells us that when he went to Egypt, he had to meet historians who were able to recount the history of Egypt and of his own Greece for thousands and thousands of years. The Egyptian, the Kemetian griots and historians were able to tell Herodotus history of his own country that he, as a Greek, the so-called first historian, wasn't aware of. And then these guys were able to give him a list of something like 300 odd pharaohs that had lived before This is the 5th century BC. So this shows, again, the interest that we have had in history. Through history, people, in a way, grasp at immortality in a way. When we praise our ancestors, when we maintain the memory of our great figures, when we have an active history that we control, in a sense, we are, reaching for immortality. When we build monuments to our great heroes, that's a way of immortalizing them, of establishing that continuity between the past and the present. And so it should come as no surprise then that there has always been a close link between history and religion. Many of the world's great religious books, including the Bible, are to some extent historical works. If you look at the Bible in the Old Testament, you'll find all kinds of historical information, real historical information concerning our history, for example. You'll find Nubian pharaohs like Shabaka, the man they called So, in the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings. You'll find So going to Israel to help the Israelites against the Assyrians. You'll find many other references to real figures in our history. And so you'll find that in many religions, religion and history very often start at almost the same point. And very often, history starts at a point where the gods walk the earth. In ancient Kemet, Osiris walked the earth, and Isis. In Ghana, the gods were the ones who handed down the golden stool to the Ashanti people and so on. So here again, in this close link between history and religion, you have an indication of the centrality then of history in the human experience. And so a race, in many ways, when it comes to history, is almost like a family. Just as the family wants to know its genealogy and wants to guard its genealogy, guard its history, a race of people has that same desire, that same need to collectively guard its history, to control its history. Unfortunately, just as history is a very positive, perhaps the most positive of all endeavors in the correct hands, something that empowers us and establishes that continuity with our ancestors. In the wrong hands, history can be used, and unfortunately has often been used as a very negative force. You can almost tell a race that has power by the fact that it controls its history. If you find a race loses power, such a race very often loses control over its history. In fact, one of the great indicators of the power or lack thereof of any race of people is the ability or lack of ability of that people to control its own history. The loss of control over one's history is an indicator of weakness, just as any other indicator in income or gross domestic product or what have you. If you look at our current situation now, for the last several hundred years, because of our enslavement, we have been in a very unfortunate position where others have tried to impose on us a distorted view of our history as a means of further oppressing us. If you look around at our major figures, our major historical figures, you'll find that many of our major historical figures today are still in the grasp of alien historians. Marcus Garvey, I think, is one of the few of our historians where black historians have been able to control the interpretation on the output and the product of material coming out pertaining to Marcus Garvey. If you look at Martin Luther King, if you look at Booker T. Washington, even Malcolm X to some degree, you'll find a whole heap of alien historians, sitting on many of our historical figures. And this is an indication of the unfortunate situation that we have been in for the last 500 years, and an indication of the struggle that we are now faced with to reclaim our history, to reclaim control over our history. I was very perturbed about 10, 11, 12 years ago when I received a flyer from a large Eastern university, and they were getting ready to put together a PhD program in the Black Studies, in Black Studies, a Black Studies PhD program. And they sent out what was to be their required course for all of the students coming into this PhD program. And there was this great black books course that all the students coming into the program would have to do, a basic kind of prerequisite. And I looked at the list of books there, and more than half of them were by non-African people. And I said to myself, what kind of a black history PhD is this? If the required course, if you're forcing these students to learn the interpretation of our people put forth by those who have oppressed us, those who have enslaved us, those who have continued to hassle us. What kind of a black history course is that? And that, to my mind, was a very sad but very graphic indication of the problem that we face, whereby our history, the most sacred of all subjects, has been to some degree infiltrated, almost taken over in some instances, by alien people. If one looks at other people who are in a more powerful position today, you can see the contrast. Can you imagine a Jewish studies program at the PhD level or any other level, the elementary school level for that matter, where most of the books written by black folk, or even by white Gentiles for that matter. German Gentiles. There are very few books on Jewish history written by anybody but Jews. Very, very, very few. In fact, maybe 1 or 2%. Can you imagine, a PhD program on Chinese history, where Japanese historians are the ones who control the product? A few years ago, Japan and China almost came to blows. They almost had a diplomatic war going on over the question of history, the interpretation of Chinese history, because the Japanese in the 1930s had gone to China, Manchuria, and killed a lot of people. And the Japanese were trying to pretend this didn't happen. And the Chinese, of course, were insisting that the record had to be correct. And some kind of a cabinet minister or somebody actually had to resign in Japan over this issue. A question of who would control the Chinese people's history. So you have it for the Chinese, you have it for the Jews, you have it for just about everybody. History then, like I said, is family business. It's something sacred over which we should have our control. The question arises then, how did we arrive at this lamentable position? How did we find ourselves in this unfortunate position? There was a time when Africans were a respected people in the world, and our history reflected that fact. I mentioned before that the first European historian, Herodotus, actually had to travel to Kemet and interview Kemetian historians to find out his own history, as well as the history of Kemet itself. In those days, other folks praised us. The first white person in the history of the world to ever write a book, if indeed he did write it, was Homer. And he wrote those 2 books, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And if you look at those 2 books, the first 2 books ever written by a white man, and I say by a white man because, as we know, Africans were literate 2,500 years before Homer. Homer wrote around 900 BC. We now know that Africans had already invented hieroglyphics, not even in Kemet, but in Nubia. 3,500 BC writing, we had already invented writing, 2,500 years before Homer. So the first European to write a book around about 900 BC, Homer. If you look at his book, you'll find an almost embarrassing set of praise inside there to Africans. Homer said Africans were the most handsome people. They were the strongest people. They were the longest lived people. They were the holiest people. The Greek gods used to have to go to Ethiopia every year to sojourn with the Ethiopian gods, to kind of rejuvenate their holiness, so to speak. Just as all the stereotypes concerning black folk today are negative, in that period, all the stereotypes were positive. Because we were powerful people, we were respected, and people respected our control over our own history. That process began to break down somewhere around the 5th century AD with the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. It was a Jewish holy book that began the seeds of that assault on our history, which culminated later on during the slave period. Around the 5th century AD, the Talmud came up with this notion that black people were cursed by God, what they call the Hamitic myth, the so-called curse of Ham, the Hamitic myth. First appeared in the Jewish Talmud around about the 5th century, whereby these Jews went back to the Bible, the story of Noah. They took the story of Noah from Genesis, where Noah supposedly cursed his son Ham because Noah was drunk in his tent, and Ham looked at Noah while he was drunk and naked and whatnot. And supposedly Noah therefore cursed Ham and Ham's children, Canaan and his children after him. And the Jewish people in the Talmud somehow took this story and put a kind of a racial twist on it. And they came up with the idea that Ham was the first African, the progenitor of the African race, the world's first African, and that when God cursed Ham, they argued he was in fact cursing the African race. And then they went on to elaborate and invent a whole bunch of amazing foolishness. They said that black skin was part of the curse because they said that Noah was lying down in a tent in the night, in the darkness. So when Ham looked at him in the darkness, in order to curse Ham, God turned Ham and his descendants black. And the Talmud said that because it was night, Ham had to open his eyes kind of wide to look at Noah. And that's the reason why black folk had large red eyes. And apparently he had to twist his head to look at his father naked, and so we had crinkly hair. And this holy book, and this is an incredible holy book, this is the most incredible holy book I've ever come across. But this holy book even went so far as to say that Ham had anal sex with his father. Now, how they got that out of the biblical story of Noah, there's no such suggestion in the biblical story. But they came up with the notion that Ham somehow had anal sex with his father. Ham buggered his father, and that's why they said black males have large penises as part of the curse, because Ham had buggered his father. I mean, this sounds like madness, but this is the people's holy book, the Talmud. And I like to always give my authority, my source when I talk about this. And my source is Harold D. Brackman, Jewish scholar. It's from his PhD dissertation, which was done in the great city of Los Angeles, UCLA, 1977. He had a PhD thesis dissertation called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a history of black-Jewish relations. And what's so interesting about this man, Brackman, is that he worked, and as far as I know, he probably still works for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is one of the most rabid of all the Jewish agencies. So this is a very good source. Here's a man working for the Simon Wiesenthal Center talking all this foolishness. It's right there in his dissertation. Of course, the fact that it's in his dissertation has not prevented him from denying it. He actually denied he ever said it, but it's right there in his dissertation. He wrote a letter to the New York Times some years ago denying that he ever said this stuff. He wrote a whole bunch of letters to a whole bunch of black newspapers in the 1990s, but it's right there in his dissertation. But that's a whole other story. So this Hamitic myth then kind of lay around Europe, and then when the slave trade started, about 1,000 years later, in the 15th century, both the Christian and the Jewish slave traders then reached back and kind of, dusted off this old story, and this became one of the main pretexts for enslaving Africans now. The idea that God himself had cursed Africans. And added to this then was a huge assault on our history. They began to say that Africans had no history at all, and therefore weren't people. If you're lacking in history, it means you aren't human. To be human is to have a history. So they said that A, God had cursed Africans, B, Africans had no history. And those who acknowledged that we had some history then began to turn that history upside down. They took ancient Kemet, the whole Nile Valley, and began to say, well, that had nothing to do with Africans. That was European, it was Hamite, it was Semite. They invented all kinds of terms, anything they could think of except African, to kind of, to talk about what happened in ancient Egypt, in the Kemet, in the Nile Valley generally. So they said that had nothing to do with us. They said we had never been civilized. We who had built the world's first great civilizations, who had invented writing, who had invented architecture, up to today. One of those great pyramids in Giza, near Cairo, modern Cairo, is the largest building ever constructed by human beings up to today. Up to today, there's no skyscraper built today that's as huge as the so-called Great Pyramid of Giza. So here were we, people who had invented all of this, who had basically started civilization, and the time came because of our enslavement when Europeans turned our history upside down. And they turned our history upside down as a means of oppressing us. So in other words, history then became a tool of oppression. Just as history in our own hands can be a tool of liberation and a tool of empowerment in the hands of those who oppressed us, history then became a rationale for further oppression and a tool of subjugation. Some of the most prestigious scholars who came through Europe, put forward these ideas. People like Hegel, a famous guy called George Frederick William Hegel, one of the famous philosophers coming out of Europe. He put forward the idea that he had a history of world history, so to speak. And he said that you can see history happening in every part of the world. But he said when it comes to Africa, that's the only place where there's no history. There's nothing to record, nothing to recount. Nothing ever happened there. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence, You know, he wrote this famous book called Notes on the State of Virginia, around about 1781, where he too said that Africans, you know, were not human, we were half ape. He said African women had sex with orangutans in the jungle. He said that we had no history. He said whatever happened in ancient Rome and Egypt and stuff had nothing to do with us. And again, all of this was a means of further oppressing us. In other words, turning our history upside down became part of the stratagem for trying to argue that we were less than human. Fortunately for us, from very early, we had intellectuals among us who began to fight back. That struggle to rehabilitate our history is a very ancient struggle. And today, in groups like this, and thanks to ASCAC, you know, that struggle now has reached a high point, a crescendo. But that struggle has been going on for a long time, and those of us who are involved in that struggle today to reclaim our history, and in reclaiming our history to also rehabilitate our race, we have a great debt. We owe a great debt to many people who have gone before us for the last couple of 100 years. You have people like David Walker. David Walker's Appeal was written in 1829, one of the first books, full-length books written in African America, 1829, and it shows what a high, you know, what a high level we got off at. You know, we kind of started the struggle of reclaiming our history at a very high level. This is 1829, when the vast majority of our people were still enslaved. David Walker wrote this incredible book, David Walker's Appeal, in Boston, 1829, in which he pointed out that the ancient Kemetians were African. He said the ancient Egyptians, if you looked at them, they looked just like any group of African Americans you see today. And of course, today being 1829, but it's still true today. He said some were light, some were dark, some were in between, but it was no different from today, he said. He said this was an African civilization. This is, you know, he blew on Thomas Jefferson. He pointed out that Thomas Jefferson didn't have a clue what he was talking about. Interestingly enough, David Walker told his readers that they should all go and buy Thomas Jefferson's book. I think Brother Len a minute ago talked about knowing your enemy. And this was, David Walker's idea, that you had to know your enemy. You had to know where your enemy was coming from. So he said, yes, go and read Thomas Jefferson's book to see, you know, where somebody who is a revered figure in white America, where he's coming from, what he thinks of the African element, in this country. You had Freedom's Journal, the very first African-American newspaper ever published, 1827 in New York City, 1827. This is 2 years before David Walker's Appeal. On the very first page of the first issue in 1827 of Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper ever, they began to serialize the biography of one of our heroes, and a man who hadn't been dead for very long. But so great was their interest in the history of our people, and so great was their realization of the fact that we had to reclaim our history in order to progress, that they began to publish the biography, you know, in installments of Paul Coffey. Paul Coffey had only died about 20 years earlier. Paul Coffey is one of our great nationalist, Pan-Africanist forebears. Paul Coffey is a man who, even in the midst of slavery, was able to amass a fortune. Imagine a man in the early 1800s, when maybe 90-something% of our people were enslaved. Imagine a black man in Massachusetts being able to amass enough money to have ocean-going ships. Long before Garvey's Black Star Line, Paul Coffey had ocean-going ships. Paul Coffey had ships that sailed to the Caribbean. He sailed to England in his own ships. He sailed to Sierra Leone in West Africa in his own ships. This is 1811, 1812, 1815, 16, in that period. Here was a black man in America with his own ships, sailing to Africa. I don't know how many of us can sail to Africa today in our own ships. I don't know if we can sail anywhere at all in our own ships today. So here you had a really great figure, somebody who had to be revered. And not only was Paul Coffey able to amass this kind of material, finances and so on, but he was able to and willing to use this wealth to uplift the race. Paul Coffey was one who tried to organize a repatriation back to West Africa, to Sierra Leone. Paul Coffey was a man who refused to pay taxes in Massachusetts because black folk didn't have access to the benefits of the state. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't send their children to the state schools and so on, so he said he wasn't paying any taxes. So this was Paul Coffey. So Paul Coffey's story then was serialized, it was published in installments in the very first black newspaper. So you find then that, again, in this very early period, those among us who stood up, and took the leadership role in this effort to rehabilitate our history, they started off at a very, very high level. In the first editorial on the first page of that Freedom's Journal in 1827, there's a very interesting quotation there, which is often repeated. And the editor said something like this, quote, they said, "Too long have others spoken for us. We wish to plead our own cause." And they went on to say that they wish to plead their own cause not only in the face of racists, but also in the face of white liberals, both. You had Robert Benjamin Lewis, a man who published the first African-American history book. Wrote it back in 1836, published it in 1844. It's 1836 now when he wrote this book. And already he was pointing out that people like Hannibal in Carthage, was an African. Again, he was pointing out that the ancient Egyptians were African and so on. This is 1836. So we have a very proud tradition. And many of these people began to collect books, anything they could find pertaining to the race, they would collect. To the point now where they set the stage for a lot of very famous black bibliophiles or book collectors who came afterwards. In fact, some of the books in the Schomburg collection in New York City are books collected by some of these people way back in the 1800s. And they were maintained, passed from one bibliophile to the next, and they ended up with Arthur Schomburg, and they're now available to us, in our generation, in the Schomburg. Garvey, one of our greatest leaders, was another example of somebody who understood the role of history in our rehabilitation. And again, Garvey wasn't, satisfied just to build a movement and to, and build material progress, but again, he realized the spiritual value of controlling our own history. Garvey said that history is written with likes and dislikes. That's the way he put it. History, he said, is written with likes and dislikes. And he said there never was a white historian who wrote with any true love or feeling for the African race. Garvey said it takes the slave to interpret the reality of the slave. It takes somebody who has suffered to write the history of somebody who has suffered. So we were on an upward path, as Brother Len would say, in the 19th century, the early 20th century. Then we ran into a little roadblock in the early 20th century when the integrationist movement moved into high gear. You had groups like the NAACP, which was founded in 1909 by Jews and white liberals for black people. You had one black member of the national executive of the NAACP when it was founded. That was W.E.B. Du Bois, if indeed he could have been called black at that point in his history. But the fact is, giving him the benefit of the doubt, you had one black member of the NAACP's national executive. This is something that still surprises a lot of people when I mention this. There was only one black person in the national executive of the NAACP. For most of the NAACP's history from 1909, when it started, up to 1975, it never had a black chairperson. The NAACP got its first black chairperson, Margaret Bush Wilson of St. Louis, in 1975. And for most of that period, the chairpersons of the NAACPs were Jews. There was Joel Spingarn, who was chair for about 30 years. There was his brother, Arthur Spingarn, for 10 years after him, like a Jewish royal family running the NAACP. The last chair of the NAACP was a guy called Kivy Kaplan from Boston. He dropped down dead in the airport in Boston around about 1975, and that's when finally the NAACP brought it upon themselves to have a black person. But I say all this to say that the rise of the integrationist movement in the 20th century, led by the NAACP, also brought with it a new era of alien people trying to control our history. So from the time the NAACP came on the scene, you had a whole upsurge of white and Jewish people writing our history, to the point where when you got to, say, the 1950s, I think we were actually very much on the defensive in terms of our own history. In spite of the very good work that was going on with people like Carter G. Woodson, on his Black History Month and so on, even Du Bois, who was writing a lot of history, nevertheless, by the 1950s, you had a situation where the integrationists, either white and Jewish writers or maybe some black writers who had their favor, people like, say, John Hope Franklin and others, where those were the ones who were just basically dominating historical writing. I remember when I went to grad school in 1969, that was the situation that I encountered. I could find a book by John Hope Franklin, who was black, but very much a part of that school, a book of about 600 or 700 pages, From Slavery to Freedom. Supposedly the major, definitive overview of African American history that had about 1 or 2 sentences on Marcus Garvey, a book of 600 or 700 pages. Here was Marcus Garvey, who led the largest, most powerful, most successful, most impactful, mass movement in our history, and a 700-page book, on African American history had about 1 or 2 sentences on Marcus Garvey. Garvey, became an unperson. And so they began to push a totally different view of our history. That view of our history, kind of churned up a whole bunch of people who became the experts. And again, mostly white and Jewish persons. You had, white and Jewish persons who were supposedly the experts on black culture. Imagine that, black culture. The Jewish guy called Lawrence Levine, who was touted as the expert on black culture. He probably never even been in a black neighborhood in his life, except maybe to collect some rent or something. He was the expert on black culture. A fellow called Gutman, he was the expert on black slavery. They're all experts. So this is the situation then that we inherited in the 1960s. Luckily for us in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement began to change into a sort of into the black power movement. Again, once the struggle got going in the 1960s and nationalism began to come to the fore again, once again, we began to realize instinctively that the struggle would not be complete unless it also incorporated within it that element of trying to regain our history and reclaim our past, reclaim our heritage. And so you find that it was in the 1960s then that, again, a whole bunch of African historians came on the scene and began working, and a whole variety of developments took place. First of all, you had little black publishing houses coming into being. You had people like, say, Broadside Press in Detroit. You had Third World Press here in Chicago. You had, black folk beginning to realize that the only way ultimately to control our story was to publish our own work. And again, Brother Len mentioned that in terms of my situation. There's no way that I could have had the impact I did with the Jewish onslaught if I'd had to have it published someplace else. For a start, I wouldn't have gotten it published anyplace else for a start. And it was a very, empowering thing to have, access to my own, distribution network and to know the business, know how to get the word out and whatnot. And so, you had a book there that took off, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And in fact, the more they got upset and the more they tried to stop it, the more they actually helped me disseminate it. I've never had a book, I've published about 11 books so far. I've never had a book to move as quickly as that book did. And the reason why it moved so quickly was because the opposition helped it to move. I remember sitting down and watching myself on TV and, at the Nightline program, and Ted Koppel, or one of them, holding up this book, the whole screen. This is Nightline, 100 million people watching this program, and they're holding up the Jewish onslaught. I mean, there's no way I could have bought that kind of publicity. But it only became possible because I was in a position to have a product which I controlled. But there were a whole bunch of other presses coming into being. And once the black presses began to come into being, black distributors began to appear because publishing is just one part of a multifaceted production. You have to have some way of getting the books out. And of course, the black bookstores came into being. The black bookstores played a crucial role all over this country. Then the black study groups began to appear where people would buy these black books and bring the black authors in and have conversations with them, have them give lectures and so on. So you had a tremendous thing happening, and all of this, of course, led to the Afrocentric movement. And the Afrocentric movement is one of the greatest developments in a very long time in our history. And the Afrocentric movement, for the first time in a long time, was able to put those other folks on the defensive to a great degree. Part of our problem in those long, dreary years when the NAACP and those folks who were in the ascendancy was that they had the initiative very often, and we had to be reacting to them all the time. But with the Afrocentric movement and with the rise of all that support from the black publishers, from the bookstores, from the study groups, from ASCAC and so on, you had now a situation where we were able to project our own Afrocentric view of history. We were able to reclaim the Nile Valley. We were able to rehabilitate people like Marcus Garvey, who had almost disappeared from the history books. We were able to treat as heroes people like, say, Malcolm X, who in the old days might have been shunted aside as some kind of a marginal, fringe, crazy character. And because we were able to do that, and especially because we were able to rehabilitate the Nile Valley, we were able to take the initiative and put them on the defensive. Because what they realized, and what, of course, we realized, was that the Nile Valley especially was crucial to the whole sort of, the whole enterprise, if you like, of white supremacy. Because the basic argument that the white historians had always put forward was that Africans had never been civilized, that all the great civilizations had come out of white people, that the only time we had ever experienced civilization was where white people had given it to us. And so for them to admit that the Nile Valley was African, you see, they had already admitted that the Nile Valley impacted on ancient Greece, their first civilization. They had already admitted that Greece was where their stuff started. So for us to say that A, the Nile Valley was ours, and B, that it had a great influence on their first civilizations, was like pulling the rug out of the whole fabric, the whole edifice of white supremacy. Because white supremacy, in a kind of a way, depended ultimately on that argument, that they were the first, we had never done anything. So now we were pointing out that the historical record showed, on the contrary, that we were the ones who started it all, and in a sense, influenced their early beginnings of civilization. So that became an incredible battle, because there was no way they could concede that reality. And that's the reason why people like, say, Mary Lefkowitz and so many others came into being. As often happens, there's always a little Trojan horse. There was this guy, Bernal, who wrote Black Athena, who many people thought was our friend. And he, came out of the woodwork and began to halfway, pretend to be acknowledging some of what we were saying, even though he didn't acknowledge the work of the black historians who had gone before him, who had said the same thing. Bernal was saying things that all kinds of people had said before him. J.A. Rogers had said before him, Dr. Bent had said before him, John Henry Clark, all kinds of people. But Bernal pretended that these people had never existed, and he was, for the first time, discovering that maybe, yes, indeed, ancient Kemet was African. And many of us embraced him and thought he was trying to help us out until he became a little alarmed. And I think Newsweek magazine, would you believe, actually elevated him to the position of king of Afrocentrism. Newsweek magazine, they made Martin Bernal, this white man of Jewish ancestry, they made him king of Afrocentrism. Same way they made Benny Goodman king of swing, another Jewish guy. Same way they made Eminem king of hip hop, made Elvis Presley king of rock and roll. A lot of white kings out there. But when this crown of kingdom over our history, descended upon the head of Bernal, he became a little concerned. And he actually went back to the media and said, hey, he said, I'm not an Afrocentrist. He made it very clear. He made it plain. He said, I'm not an Afrocentrist. He said nothing that I've said was intended to give any support to black racists, he called us, black racists. In fact, let me quote exactly what he said here in the New Republic magazine. This is Bernal now, after he had been accepted by many, even some of our Afrocentric people had accepted him as, one of us almost. And listen to what Bernal had to say, quote, I am not an Afrocentrist. I have never been an Afrocentrist. I am sorry, he was apologizing. He said, I am sorry if some of my writings have given encouragement to black racists. I never said that the ancient Egyptians were black. He said, I merely quoted what Herodotus said. Try and figure that one out if you can. He said, I didn't say they were Negroid. That's the ancient Egyptians. He said, I have never argued that all good things come out of any one continent. Now, you see how they distort what we're trying to say. I don't know of any Afrocentrist who has ever said that all good things came out of any one continent. But they always try to create what I call a man of straw. They create a false position. Same thing happened with me during the whole Jewish onslaught debate. They claimed that I had said the Jews were genetically prone to enslaving others. But they always try to put some totally off-the-wall argument on you, and then instead of attacking what you say, they attack that. They attack what they say you said. It's a very old trick. So as far as this guy is said, as far as this guy is concerned, I say, never to beware of Greeks. There's an old expression, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Marcus Garvey said it very well. Marcus Garvey said, quote, "Never swallow wholly what the white man writes or says without first critically analyzing it and investigating it." Garvey said, "The white man's trick is to deceive other people for his own benefit and profit." So history then is crucial to what we are about. And I think that, and again, as Brother Len said, I think that we have a lot to be thankful for the period that we are living in, because we are living in a period where we have seen a reversal in that tendency to capture our history and to use our history as a tool against us. And again, and very often you can gauge your success by looking at how strident the opposition is. The more noise the people who are opposed to you make, the greater sometimes a reflection that is of how successful you are. But it is your very success that makes them so historical and makes them shout so much, because they realize that they're losing a grip that they had. I should have mentioned too, when I talked about the black publishers and so on the study groups and whatnot, I should have mentioned also the Africana Studies departments, the Black Studies departments. So you see, there's a whole network we have now, and of course this network is under great stress, it's under great attack. That's inevitable. But the fact is, this whole movement now must be a good 30, 40 years old, starting with the Black Power movement. And it's still showing signs of growing. And I think that this time around, I think that we are here to stay, and that this view of our history, that empowers us, and which is the correct view, is here to stay. So I think that even though we will suffer some reverses, it's like any war, you don't win every single battle in any war. You win some and you lose some. But I think that the general trend is upwards, and there have been some major victories in the last few years. I think of The Secret Relationship, for example, between blacks and Jews, a book which, up to now, they still haven't gotten around, a book which really shook them to the very foundations. And again, the book was so well documented. It was scholarly, it was well documented, it was firm, it was uncompromising. And that's the kind of scholarship that we have generated over the last few years. And again, I'd like to, as I always do, to thank, ASCAC and Sister Nzinga, or Queen Nzinga, because, what ASCAC has done is to provide us with an organization. It's one thing for individuals to be doing this work, but that kind of work on an individual basis can never be maximized unless there's an organization to pull it together. And this is what Marcus Garvey, this is one of his great teachings as well. And Marcus Garvey realized that there was a power in organization. It didn't matter if it lacked other kinds of power, political power, economic power, but there's a power in organization. And I think that ASCAC has really shown the way. And so from this point on, even though we may lose a battle or two, I think we have to win the war. And so once again, I say this, thank you very much. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you.